They thought they could erase a man's history with bulldozers and bricks on land that carried generations of memories. A powerful homeowners association began building hundreds of homes without a second thought for the black family who once called it their own. But what they didn't know was that buried deep within the soil was a century-old truth waiting to rise. A truth that would shake their plans to the core. What happens when history fights back? For generations, the Johnson family had lived quietly on the edge of a small southern town. Their land, stretching across open fields and shaded by tall oak trees, was more than just property. It was history. Each corner carried the laughter of children who once played there, the sweat of ancestors who worked the soil, and the pride of a family determined to hold on to what little the world had allowed them to keep. Ezekiel Johnson, the last descendant still living on the land, had built his life around it. He rose with the sun, wearing his worn blue work shirt and cap, tending to the same fields his grandfather had once plowed. Neighbors knew him as a quiet, hard-working man, respected for his dignity and calm strength. Though modest, his home was a place filled with photographs, old letters, and documents carefully preserved, proof of a legacy stretching back more than 100 years. But as the town grew, so did the hunger for land. Developers eyed those open fields with visions of concrete streets and shining new homes. To them, Ezekiel's land looked like opportunity. To Ezekiel, it was sacred ground. He could feel the weight of his ancestors in every step across the soil, and he knew that one day, someone would try to take it. That day was coming faster than he realized. At first, Ezekiel didn't notice the change. A few surveyor flags appeared at the edge of his fields, fluttering like small warnings in the wind. Then came the heavy machines, growling across the horizon. Without warning, strangers in hard hats began measuring, marking, and digging into the earth that carried his family's bloodline. When Ezekiel demanded answers, he was met with polite but dismissive smiles. The land, they told him, belonged to the homeowners association now. Documents had been filed, permits signed, and plans approved. On paper, his legacy had been erased with a single stroke of a pen. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, some urging him to give in, others too afraid to stand by him. It's progress, the HOA insisted, promising that the new development would bring jobs and growth. But to Ezekiel, it was theft dressed as opportunity. Every day, the machines tore deeper into the soil. He watched as the oak trees, silent witnesses of his ancestors' struggles, were cut down and hauled away like trash. The ground where his grandfather once planted corn was bulldozed into dust. It felt as if the history of his people was being buried alive beneath fresh concrete foundations. And yet, Ezekiel wasn't powerless. In his small wooden house, tucked inside an old chest, lay something the developers hadn't accounted for. Documents signed nearly a century ago, deeds and agreements binding the land to his family's name for generations. It wasn't just proof of ownership, it was a weapon of truth waiting to be unleashed. But time was running out. The HOA had already sold dozens of homes off blueprints, promising buyers a bright new community. Contracts worth millions were in play. If Ezekiel stood in their way, he wasn't just fighting for land. He was standing against a machine fueled by greed, power, and racial injustice. The question wasn't just whether he could stop them, it was whether he would survive the storm that was coming.
The day the confrontation came, the air felt heavy, as if even the land itself was holding its breath. Ezekiel arrived at the construction site just as workers prepared to pour the first concrete foundation. His hands shook as he clutched the weathered documents, their edges frayed from 100 years of protection. He stepped forward, standing firmly in the path of the machines. "This land is mine," he declared, voice steady despite the roar of engines. For a moment, everything froze. The workers hesitated, the HOA officials turned, and all eyes fixed on the lone man standing against an empire. But instead of respect, he was met with laughter. The head of the HOA, a polished woman in a black blazer, waved him off. "You people don't own anything," she snapped, ordering the bulldozers forward. The machine's growl grew louder, vibrating through the ground, threatening to erase not just his home, but his very existence. Ezekiel held up the deed, his voice rising with the weight of generations. "Signed in 1923. Witnessed. Recorded. My family's blood is in this soil." His words cut through the noise, a declaration that could not be ignored. And yet, the bulldozer lurched forward. Dirt and dust filled the air as steel pushed against sacred ground. For a terrifying moment, Ezekiel stood inches from destruction, the weight of injustice pressing down like the machine before him. The crowd gasped, workers muttered uneasily, and somewhere in that chaos, one undeniable truth began to surface. The HOA had underestimated not just Ezekiel, but the power of history itself. What happened next would decide whether his family's legacy lived or was buried forever.
As the bulldozer rumbled closer, voices from the crowd began to rise. Workers hesitated, whispering among themselves. Some pulled out phones, recording the confrontation. The HOA's confidence began to crack under the weight of undeniable evidence. Ezekiel's deed, yellowed with age but clear in its language, spoke louder than any modern contract. Lawyers were called, papers examined, and suddenly, the truth stood like a wall no bulldozer could cross. The Johnson family's ownership was ironclad, protected by a century-old agreement that had never been broken. The construction came to a screeching halt. Buyers who had already signed contracts demanded answers. The HOA, once smug and unshakable, now scrambled to justify what they had done. For Ezekiel, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was justice for generations silenced by greed and racism. His land remained his, but the battle revealed something deeper: how fragile justice can be when power is unchecked, and how often black voices are dismissed until forced to prove their worth with paper, pain, and persistence. The image of Ezekiel standing against the bulldozer spread across town, then across the nation. His courage became a symbol, a reminder that history cannot simply be paved over, no matter how powerful the hands holding the blueprints may seem. But the story leaves us with a haunting question. How many others, without the papers or the voice to fight back, have already lost everything? Ezekiel won his battle, but the war against injustice is far from over. And the next time power comes for what belongs to the powerless, who will stand and who will remain silent?